Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and I have another great lesson ready for y'all today. So what are we talking about? We're focusing on lipids, and lipids is just a fancy science name for fats. So lipids and fats, they're very similar, they're basically the same thing. Let's go ahead and figure out why you need them, what they do in your body, and what makes them so important. So, lipids, the main job that I really need you to remember is that they are the way to store energy in your body. Okay, the body stores lipids as reserve energy. So I want you to imagine one of those animals that live in one of those really cold environments. Think of like a polar bear or maybe a whale or a seal. Okay, so over the summer when food is plentiful, they're going to eat as much food as they can. And they're going to build up this special layer of fat called blubber. Okay, blubber is very important because it helps keep them warm in those cold environments, but also when the winter comes, when food is a lot harder to find, they're still hunting, they're still looking around for food, but there's just not as much of it. So during those times when there's not as much food, they're living off of that fat supply. They're burning those lipids off over months and months, and that helps them to survive those period of time when they really can't find much food. Okay? So lipids, they are, one thing that makes all lipids common is that a part of the fats are hydrophobic. What does hydrophobic mean? Well, if you have a phobia of something, that means you are scared of it or you hate it, right? And then if you hear the word hydro, what does that make you think of? It makes you think of hydrating, right? Hydrating is all about water. So lipids, something that all lipids have in common is that they are, or a part of them are, hydrophobic, which means they hate water, okay? And that makes them harder to break down than carbohydrates. This hydrophobic aspect of lipids is going to be really important for their function, and we'll get into that here in just a little bit, okay? So lipids, remember another word for lipids is fats. They're the same thing, okay? Lipids actually contain more energy per unit weight than carbohydrates do. Carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. Lipids have 9 calories per gram, so more than double. But it's kind of harder to break lipids down. Because of that, it's more efficient for the body to use lipids as a way to store energy. They hold more energy per gram, and they're also harder to break down. And then this last bullet point, the body will use its carbohydrate source up for initial fuel, but once the fast fuel runs out, the body will turn to breaking down lipids for a rich energy source. Okay, so we always use carbohydrates. When we're out of carbohydrates, then we'll use lipids. And if you're ever in a situation where you really can't eat anything, after your lipids are gone, your body will start to break down proteins. And that's going to be really bad because the majority of your muscles and bones are made out of proteins. Okay? So let's talk about lipids and fats in a little bit more detail. The basic units of lipids, this is the thing that makes them up, are called fatty acids. Okay, that's kind of easy to remember because we know that lipids and fats are the same thing. So what are fats made up of? They're made up of fatty acids. Okay, usually you'll have 2 or 3 fatty acid chains, and it'll be connected to something called a glycerol or a phosphate group. Okay. What's the function of lipids and fats? Well, we already mentioned that they provide energy. It's that long-term energy storage, but also they help to form the structure of your body. It cushions the body, and it's going to prevent heat loss. It kind of works like insulation, okay? And that's why those animals in really cold environments build up that blubber that I was talking about earlier. Where can you find lipids and fats? Well, butter, margarine, oils, okay, candy are all good examples of fatty foods, okay? So fats are made up of a fatty acid molecule that consists of 2 distinct regions. So you always have a hydrophobic part of the fat. Remember, hydrophobic means that it hates water. And then you also have a hydrophilic part of the fat, which means that they love water. If you kind of look at this picture over on the right, you'll see that the blue bars on the far left and far right are hydrophilic. So that's the part that loves water. That kind of pink area in the middle, that's the hydrophobic part. And so the fatty acid chains hate water. This has a very particular structure that will form out of these fatty acids that's going to be really important on here in just a couple of slides. Okay? First of all, I wanted to talk about the difference in between saturated and unsaturated fats. Anyone who's really health conscious is really monitoring these saturated versus unsaturated fats. I just kind of wanted to talk about the difference in between them. Okay, so first of all, you need to know what the word saturated means. Saturated means something is filled up all the way. So imagine you like take a towel and drop it into a bathtub filled up with water. When you pulled that towel back up out of the tub, it would be filled with water. It would be saturated. Okay, so for something to be saturated means it's filled up all the way. Saturated fats are saturated or filled up with as much carbon as they possibly can. Okay? It has lots of hydrogen. So it's saturated with carbon and hydrogen. Because of this, I'll talk more about the chemical reactions that are going on here in just a little bit, but something that I want you to remember for now is that saturated fats are solid at room temperature, and they usually come from animals. Okay, so beef, pork, chicken, as well as like butter and cheese, those all have fats in them. They're all saturated fats. And we know that they're saturated fats because they're solid at room temperature. If you just left it out on the counter, it wouldn't melt, okay? And they're coming from animals. These saturated fats are the ones that you want to try to avoid because they can clog blood vessels and lead to some cardiovascular health. Okay, so saturated fats are saturated with hydrogen, they're solid at room temperature, and they come from animals. Let's compare that to unsaturated fats. Okay, unsaturated fats have a lot of double and triple bonds between the carbons, and that means that there are fewer hydrogen bonds in them. So they are unsaturated with hydrogen atoms. They're not filled up all the way. When those carbons make a double bond in between two carbons, that's one less hydrogen atom that it can hold. Because of this, and I'll talk about the biochemical reasons here in just a second, but because of this, unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature. So examples of these would be like oils, olive oil, any type of oil is always liquid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature, and they come from plants. And these are the fats that are healthier for you. So I know that's kind of counterintuitive. People a lot of times think you just want to avoid fats altogether, but some of the fats are good for you. Unsaturated fats are the ones that you really want. Okay? So let me take a second and talk about why the saturated fats are solid and the unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. So let me kind of step out of the way. Look at these pictures here. Look at the saturated fats. You see how that's a nice, long, straight line. It almost looks like a brick. Okay, so these stack on top of each other really, really well. It's kind of like imagine bricks in a building. Okay, compare that to the unsaturated fats. You see that little twist there towards the end. There's a double bond in between two carbon atoms. That gives the unsaturated fat this little twist at the end. And because of that, it's not a nice straight line like the saturated fats are. So the unsaturated fats don't really stack on top of each other very well. And what that means is they just kind of slide past each other instead of stacking up like the saturated fats do. So that's why saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature and unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature. Basically, the saturated fats just kind of build on top of each other better than the unsaturated fats. You want unsaturated fats in your diet. You want to avoid saturated fats if you can. Okay, great. So I have a couple of examples of foods that would have a lot of fats in them. Here I got a big old block of butter. Also, oils would have a lot of fats in them. Any type of greasy food, grease is an example of lipids. So when you're frying that burger or you're frying the fries in oil, that's all going to have a lot of oils and fats in it. One thing that fats do for our food, though, is that they enhance the texture of the food. So food that has a lot of fats in it tends to have a very good consistency to it. Some other examples here are like potato chips. You got to fry them in something. There's a donut there. There's going to be like a lot of grease and oil to make that donut. You got to fry it in something, right? As well as any kind of fried foods. Okay, so these are all examples of foods that are high in lipids. Okay. Okay, so this is a very important type of lipid for our biology class. It's called a phospholipid. So give me a couple slides to explain this and why it's so important. So what is a phospholipid? Well, it's a lipid that has a phosphate group. So if you look at that picture, the red circle, it's got a P in it, that's a phosphate group. And then those two little blue lines are fatty acid chains. So a phospholipid is a lipid with a phosphate group and two fatty acid chains. The head, the phospho group, the phosphorus head is hydrophilic, which means it loves water, and the two fatty acid chains are hydrophobic, which means they hate water. Because of this, if you get a lot of phospholipids in the same area in water, they are going to arrange themselves in a particular way because one part loves water and one part hates water. So what happens is, imagine I take a lot of these phospholipids and I dump them in water. They will naturally, all by themselves, make this structure on the screen right here. Okay? We call this a phospholipid bilayer. That name is kind of long and confusing, but if you think about it, it just kind of tells you what's going on. First of all, what is a layer? A layer is like one flat line of something, right? Bi, like bicycle, means two. So there are two layers. What are there two layers of? There's two layers of phospholipids. Each of those little circles with the little tails coming off of it is a phospholipid. So if you take a lot of phospholipids, you put it in water, they will naturally make this arrangement. All the tails that hate water are in the middle, they're away from the water. All of the heads, the hydrophilic heads, are towards the outside, closer to the water. And this is very important because all of our cells, every single cell that you can think of that we've been talking about over the past couple weeks, uses this phospholipid bilayer as the cell membrane. So you can kind of see the arrangement here, okay? There's two layers of these phospholipids, and it kind of separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. Okay, and this is because of the hydrophobic and hydrophilic aspects of this type of fat. Okay, great job, y'all. So I have a couple of review questions I wanted to do with y'all, and then your teacher will pass out a worksheet here in just a second, and we'll practice a little bit more. So let's go ahead and hop into this and see what y'all remember. Okay, so first of all, what are the elements that make up lipids? What are the elements that make up lipids? Okay, so the word that I want you to remember here is CHO. Okay, remember CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So lipids and carbohydrates are actually made up of the same thing. They're both made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The only difference is carbohydrates has that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio in between carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and those numbers don't really matter quite as much for lipids. Okay, well, what are the components of a lipid? Lipids are made up of something. What are they made up of? Does anyone remember? You might remember that the components of a lipid are fatty acid chains, and usually they are joined together by a glycerol. If you have a glycerol in that top right corner, that's an example. So if you have a glycerol and 3 fatty acid chains connected to it, we would call that a triglyceride because there's a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acid chains, a triglycerol. Okay? So something else I need you to remember, that these phospholipids make up the cell membranes of every cell, and that's because of the hydrophobic and hydrophilic nature of those types of fats. Okay, let's talk about some functions and examples of lipids. Does anyone remember the main function of a lipid? What is its main job? That's right, it's long-term energy storage. This is how your body takes energy that you don't need right away and stores it for later use. Maybe you have plenty of food right now, but like that bear, whale, and seal during the winter when the food's not quite as plentiful, you need something to live off of during those times of famine. So that's what lipids are there for, long-term energy storage. Okay, what's another function of lipids? Where else can we find them in your body or in your cell? That's right, they make up the cell membrane. Remember that every cell membrane and every organism, every cell has that phospholipid bilayer. 2 layers of phospholipids that just naturally block out the water, and it makes a really good distinction in between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. Okay, great job. So what's the last function of these lipids? I'm not sure if I really mentioned these today, but some hormones are made up of lipids. So examples of these would be like testosterone and estrogen. Those are chemical signals, and they kind of are a way that your body communicates with itself. Okay, so these are a couple of functions and components and elements that make up lipids. So what I'd like for y'all to do now, teacher, if you could go ahead and pass out the worksheet that I have ready for y'all in Canvas, okay? Why don't y'all take 5 or 10 minutes? I think it's just maybe 10 questions. Y'all work on it, have students team up with a partner maybe if they need to, and then when y'all are ready, y'all come on back and I'll review it with y'all, and then that way everybody will be on the same page. So go ahead and pause the video, and then when you're ready, y'all can come on back and we'll see what y'all came up with. All right, I know this worksheet didn't give y'all any trouble at all, but just in case someone is a little confused, let's make sure we review it together. Y'all go ahead and change or add anything you need to, and that way we'll all be on the same page. All right, so number 1 says here, what elements do lipids contain? So I kind of gave y'all a little word to remember for lipids. What elements can you find inside of lipids? Well, y'all are right. You might remember that word as CHO. If you can remember CHO, you can remember what elements are inside of lipids, because the elements that make up lipids are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. CHO. Nice and easy to remember, right? All right, number 2. How can you tell a lipid from a carbohydrate from its molecular formula? That's kind of a tricky question. Well, what this is really asking is, lipids and carbohydrates have the same elements in them. They're both CHO, CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So how could you tell the difference in between them by looking at their molecular formula? Well, you might remember that carbohydrates, carbs, always have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, okay? Lipids don't have that exact ratio. So you can really have any number of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, where carbohydrates always has a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Another way to tell the difference is that carbohydrates often look like rings, okay? So we often draw them as rings. Okay? You might remember from our carbohydrate unit earlier, you draw them as rings. So a monosaccharide is 1 ring of sugar, a disaccharide is 2 rings of sugar. Lipids don't really have that structure. Okay, so number 3, list 3 differences between saturated fats and unsaturated fats. All right, so let me do it like this. I'm going to write saturated fats over here, and then I'll write unsaturated over here. All right, so what are some differences in between them that y'all came up with? Okay, well, when I'm looking at these, some things that I think are really, really important. First, saturated fats are solid at room temperature, while unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. Okay, so think of like oil versus butter, right? They kind of have the same job. You use them to cook with, right? But butter is solid at room temperature, so it's saturated. That's the bad kind of fat. While oils are liquid at room temperature, and they're the good types of fat. So it's maybe a little bit better to cook with oil over butter. Okay, what's another difference in between them? Well, saturated fats come from animals. All right, and unsaturated fats usually come from plants. So that's another difference. Okay? So those are 2 differences in between them. There's a couple different things we could write here. Saturated fats are the unhealthy type. Unsaturated fats are the healthy type, so that would be a difference in between them. But I think what we really should focus on here is that saturated fats have more hydrogen. Okay, more hydrogen, and unsaturated fats have less hydrogen. And so that's how you could tell the difference in between them. If you're looking at 2 pictures, one's saturated, one's unsaturated, those unsaturated fats are going to have double bonds in between some of the carbons, and they're not going to have as many hydrogens as the saturated fats do. Okay, great. So I've got a couple more. Go ahead and make sure y'all have this down, and then we'll come back and do the other 5 or so questions here in just a second. All right, great. So I'm going to move on now. All right, let's see what we got here. All right, 4. What type of fat is below? It's got a very particular shape to it. It's a phosphate group up top. I see that there's a P in the molecular formula, and then it's got these 2 fatty acid chains. Does anyone remember what this is called? This is a very important type of fat. It's called a phospholipid. It's called a phospholipid. Phospholipids make up our cell membranes. Something I need you to remember, the phosphate group up top, the HAD, is hydrophilic, so it likes water, and the tails down here are hydrophobic. They don't like water, and so they naturally arrange themselves where the HADs are always towards the water and the tails are facing inwards towards each other away from the water. Okay, great. So 5 and 6 are kind of talking about that a little bit. 5, what does hydrophilic mean? And then 6 says, what does hydrophobic mean? Well, hydrophilic means, hydro means water, and philic means love of. So this means water loving. Okay? And then let's look at number 6. It says hydrophobic. Same prefix, hydro means water, but this time phobic, like if you have a phobia, that means you're scared of something or you hate it. And so this means water hating. They're kind of opposites. Okay? And all fats have some part of it is hydrophobic. All right, let's look at 7. Phospholipids make up a major component of what part of the cell? Does anyone remember what part of the cell is mostly made up of phospholipids? That's right, it is the cell membrane. Okay, great. 8, what are the major functions of lipids? We've talked about a couple of their different functions. One that we really want to know is that it's long-term energy. Okay? That might be the most important one to remember. Long-term energy. Okay? What are some other functions of lipids? Well, we talked about how they make up the cell membrane. That's really important. I think something else we want to put here is that they help keep you warm. We might say insulation too. To insulate something means to make sure it's staying warm. Okay, so 9. What is one characteristic that all lipids share? Okay, I kind of mentioned this just a second ago. All lipids, some part of them are hydrophobic. Okay? All right, here's our last one. Thanks for hanging in there with me. 10. What are the components of a triglyceride molecule? Okay, well, there's definitely one part of this word that I recognize, tri, T-R-I. What does that mean? Well, you got like a triangle and a tricycle. So tri means 3, right? Okay, so there's 3 of something. What are there 3 of? There's going to be, in a triglyceride, there's always going to be 3 fatty acids. Okay, 3 fatty acids. And it's always going to be connected to a glycerol molecule. Okay, so what are the components of a triglyceride? It's 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. Okay, y'all, great job. Thank y'all so much for following along with me today. Your teacher has some other work. Please make sure you give that your best effort so that you can really practice this stuff. Make sure you knock that out of the park, and I hope you have a great day.